We're going to move right into the presidential candidates right now, from the grassroots activists on the front lines of the environmental justice struggle. Again, the candidates who have agreed to attend tonight's first ever presidential forum on environmental justice are Tom Steyer, Senators Elizabeth Warren and Cory Booker, John Delaney, Joe Sestak, and Marianne Williamson. We begin with 3 minutes of a public statement by Tom Steyer.
Good evening. Let me start by saying that environmental justice is not an afterthought at all for me. It is absolutely central to what I'm doing. I have said that climate is the #1 priority of my presidency, and that I'll declare a state of emergency on day one. But that climate plan is described as a justice-based climate plan, and environmental justice is the planning process that we're going to use in order to make sure that it's just and that the communities where pollution has been concentrated will be in the lead in terms of policy and execution. I think a lot of the people who are going to follow me here at this podium are going to talk to you about what they're going to do. But I want to tell you what I've done over the last decade. I led the fight for clean energy in California, and the reason we won was because environmental justice was at the heart. That fight has put together the biggest pot of money to redress frontline communities where pollution, air pollution and water pollution have been centered. $1.5 billion has already been spent. There's $3 billion more in the pot to redress that, and it will continue. I've also led the fight for clean energy outside California, in Nevada, in Michigan, in Arizona, and always environmental justice has been at the center. I worked with the activists in Oxnard to stop the last fossil fuel plant I hope is ever proposed for California, which they were going to put in a low-income Latino community where they already had a series of toxic plants and where they thought they could get away with it. And I've worked with activists around this country. I've gone to Flint, Michigan. I've been to Fresno, California. I've been to East Porterville, where you can't drink the water. I've just come today from Denmark, South Carolina. It's not my first trip to Denmark. I know what the water situation there is, and I also know that it's going to be much broader than people know. You can't do climate, you can't do the environment, you can't do pollution unless you have environmental justice at its core. Environmental justice is just another word for saying racism. They've chosen to concentrate air and water pollution in Black and brown communities, and specifically African-American communities. So if we're going to repair that injustice, we're going to have to do it deliberately in terms of clean air, clean waters, and as we rebuild this country in a sustainable way, the people from those communities have to be in the front of the line for the millions of good jobs that we're going to create. And I want to finish on a hopeful note. The best environmental justice project I've ever seen in the United States is in South Carolina. It's in Spartanburg. It's the Regenesis Project. It's fantastic. I know Mustafa's worked on it, started by a fantastic, brilliant man named Harold Mitchell from South Carolina.
Tom, welcome.
Mustafa, nice to see you.
It's good to see you too. You mentioned environmental racism. So let's start off with a basic question that all candidates should be able to answer, especially for the audience that we have here tonight. How do you define environmental justice, and how do you define environmental racism?
Look, I don't think there's any question that this country has focused its air pollution and its water pollution in communities of color. And I think that if you look around, you can look at South Carolina, you can look at every part of this country, and I think it's just the tip of the iceberg that we know right now. Yes, I know what's happened in Denmark. I've talked to the activists there and worked with them. But I can tell you, I think we're going to see that across South Carolina. I think it's going to be based on race. I know if you go to Flint, Michigan, ask who lives there. If you go to Newark, ask who lives there. Go to East Porterville, go to Fresno. West Fresno has a 15-year lower life expectancy than North Fresno that's 2 miles away. It's based on pollution of every kind you can think of. So when I look around the United States of America, I know that the politics have concentrated the dangerous health of pollution in the communities of color, specifically African American.
So let's go a little bit deeper. Environmental racism is the new Jim Crow. In regards to food, housing, jobs, education, what is your plan to address environmental racism?
Well, we are going to, look, this is my #1 priority, is to rebuild this country in a sustainable fashion and to make sure that we handle the climate crisis. But we're going to do it with environmental justice in the lead. So that means as we rebuild this country, whether that's the $90 billion that we're going to spend on residential water, whether that's the $700 billion that we're going to spend on the grid, whether it's rebuilding the roads or the public transit systems, I am going to make sure that the planning process starts in the communities, and they start with the leaders from communities like Denmark, South Carolina, to make sure that as we do this, we redress the air and water problems specifically, and that the jobs go to those communities first. So when I think about this redressing, it's everything. I mean, Mustafa, you asked a question that suggested, is it just air and water pollution? No, it goes far beyond that. And I believe we can rebuild this country spiritually as well as physically by undoing this injustice and this racism, specifically through a gigantic program of rebirth.
Tom Steyer, there's been a lot of talk about billionaires in the last few weeks in the presidential race, and there may be another one entering the race, Michael Bloomberg. It's not clear if one of the candidates, President Trump, is one himself. But you, at this point, are the only billionaire in the Democratic primary as you run for president in 2020. How do you talk about the issue of environmental justice and economic equity? The Climate Accountability Institute did a study saying the world's wealthiest corporations are most responsible for the climate crisis. And of course, the communities of color, indigenous communities, are most impacted by that crisis. The Climate Accountability Institute says more than 70% of global emissions come from just 100 companies. What have you done to challenge your fellow billionaires when it comes to this inequity? And what would you do as president?
So let me say this. I started a business. I ran it for 27 years. I started in one room with no employees, not even any windows in the room. Then I took the giving pledge to give more than half my money to good causes while I was alive. I walked away from my business to build coalitions of normal American citizens to take on unchecked corporate power. And together, we've been beating them for over a decade. I've taken on the oil companies, I've taken on the tobacco companies, I've taken on the utilities, I've taken on the drug companies. So Amy, when you ask me what I'm gonna do, the reason I'm running for president is because I believe these corporations have bought the government. That is my reason for running. We're not getting what we want. We're not getting anything we want until we break. They are strangling our government and they are strangling us. And until we beat them, we're getting nothing, because that's what they want us to have. So when I look about clean air and clean water, when I look at environmental racism, we're gonna have to beat the corporation first. And there's no one else who's gonna come on this stage, there's no one else running for president who's gonna talk about term limits for every congressperson and senator of 12 years. There's no one who's gonna talk about a national referendum to let the people of the United States pass laws when the Congress won't do it, take away their monopoly to pass laws. So this is my whole, look, I have a track record for a decade as an outsider of taking these people on. They're not that smart, but they are that mean. And what I've seen and honestly, environmental racism is a perfect example. They are willing to hurt people for money. And it's not a heck of a lot more complicated than that. And so what am I willing to do? I am willing to do whatever it takes to break that corporate stranglehold, and that's my history.
Do you think corporate executives should be put on trial? For example, in New York, you have the lawsuit against ExxonMobil. If you can explain the significance of this lawsuit, just last week, 30 school children led a 42-minute die-in outside the ExxonMobil trial as Rex Tillerson, the former CEO of ExxonMobil, the former Secretary of State under Trump, was testifying. 42 minutes, as one 13-year-old activist, Maria Riker, said to us, 42 minutes for the 42 years that ExxonMobil covered up climate change.
So let me say this about corporations. They're not above the law. I started the Need to Impeach movement because the president isn't above the law. I promise you I don't think corporate executives are above the law. So what does that mean? It means if they paid $300 billion worth of fines because of the mortgage crisis and no one went to jail, how could that be right? If we put drug dealers in jail, why don't we put corporate drug dealers in jail? If Exxon lied and endangered the health and safety, not just of everybody in this room, but everybody in this country, are you telling me they're above the law because they did it within a corporate system? No way. So you're asking me, Amy, what am I willing to do? I'm willing to hold them accountable for crime. And they are not above the law. If I'm not scared of the president, I promise you I'm not scared of the ExxonMobil Corporation.
So let me ask one last follow-up. In the last weeks, in a leaked audio recording, Mark Zuckerberg, the CEO of Facebook, was captured on tape saying, and please excuse me for using this language, that if Elizabeth Warren were to become president, it would suck for his company. What are your comments about what he had to say?
Look. Corporations think, and they've been right, that they can write the laws of the United States of America for their benefit. The government of the United States is supposed to be of, by, and for the people. We have got to take away the rights of the heads of these huge corporations, like Mark Zuckerberg, to think they run our country for themselves and their corporations. That's got to end. So who gets elected president should be dependent on who's going to do the best job for the American people, who can they trust, and who calls out the problem. This election is about calling out the problem. And the problem is they own the government. And we're not changing anything until we change that.
Mr. Steyer, you talked about making sure that you're holding people accountable. So what would you do in the instance that we find ourselves in right now? So at the Environmental Protection Agency, the enforcement work that has happened there has become minimized greatly. The cases that are brought forward, inspectors going out making sure that businesses and industries are in compliance. So what would be your plan to enhance enforcement that would help the communities that are here in the audience?
So I just want to start with the fact that every American has a right to clean air and clean water, period. So when you think about the Environmental Protection Agency, they're there to enforce that. And if they're corporations who are poisoning us, then we have to know it and we have to end it and we have to punish it. So when I think about the Environmental Protection Agency, it's got to be an enforcement agency that is carrying out the right of every single American to clean air and clean water. And we're going to make that happen. So part of it's enforcement, but a big part of this is bringing the money, bringing the resources to the communities that don't have clean air and clean water and making sure that we rebuild in a way that they do.
Well, let me follow up on that just real quickly. So we know that the funding to address the environmental injustices that have happened both in the past and the present is extremely limited. How would you redirect resources to help those communities?
So, Mustafa, I would declare a state of emergency on climate on the first day of my presidency.
Okay.
I would use the emergency powers of the presidency, because it's an emergency, to change the rules without needing Congress. I'm going to ask Congress. I'm going to give them 100 days. Pass the Green New Deal. I'm begging you. But they're 0 for 28 years. So for everybody who's counting on the Green New Deal, this is a group that's 0 for 28 years. And I want to say, on day one, we're getting going. So what am I going to do? On day one, we're using the emergency powers of the presidency to get going on this problem with environmental justice, the redress of environmental racism at the core of what we do.
All right.
Tom Steyer, you make very clear that you support the Green New Deal. What about what is being called a Red New Deal for indigenous communities? What specific funding opportunities would your administration provide for tribal nations, communities who wish to make a just transition towards sustainable housing and renewable energy? And how would you negotiate with tribes? For example, what would you do around pipelines? Standing Rock Sioux Reservation wants the Dakota Access Pipeline stopped now.
So Amy, no pipelines. That's my rule on pipelines. No pipelines. There is no reason that we should spend one more penny building more fossil fuel infrastructure that we're going to have to tear down. It makes no sense. Look, I was an investor for 30 years, and people love to talk in politics about infrastructure. And they make it sound like infrastructure is in and of itself a good thing. But if you're an investor, infrastructure is just building something and paying for it. So if you build something stupid, it's stupid. And if you build something smart and sustainable, that's valuable. So when we think about rebuilding America, we've got to think about doing it in a way that actually serves the American people, that makes it possible for us to preserve the natural world that God gave us and lets us hand it on to the next generation. So when I think about what we're going to do with indigenous people, for starters, we're not building any more pipelines across their lands. We don't have to worry about it. That's out. But I also think we've got to respect their knowledge and their awareness and give them the right of self-determination as they think about how they can proceed in a just way.
And what about the issue of environmental reparations? We just heard some very eloquent environmental justice activists talk about the destruction of their communities over decades by industrial polluters that destroy their communities and then up and leave. What would reparations look like?
They'd look like what we've done in California, is taking billions of dollars and directing them at frontline communities to make sure that we undo the damage that's happened. And it means giving the jobs to the people from those communities to undo the economic damage that's been done. It means acknowledging what's happened, being aware of what's happened, and then letting the leaders from those communities direct how we're going to undo it. That's actually what it looks like, Amy.
And what would an activated Justice Department look like if you were going to go after corporate crime, the corporate polluters? One
thing you guys should know, I would create an environmental justice department within the Justice Department. I don't think there's any way that we can actually deal with this in a significant fashion without separating it out, concentrating on it, and giving people the right and the obligation to pursue it seriously. So that's what it would look like. It would look like an organized group of people with the determination to make sure that we brought people to justice.
And I think we're going to go to a question from one of our students. Is Mr. Brandon Brown here? Mr. Brown, please approach the podium and share your question.
Call me Tom, Brandon.
Oh.
Make me feel young.
Okay, Tom. Okay. My question is, one of the issues to environmental justice is access to healthy food. What would you do to give access to healthy food to all Americans?
So if you guys could hear Brandon's question, it was access to healthy food. And this is actually a subject that's really close to my heart, because in California, my wife and I have started a program called California Food for California Kids, which is doing farm to table in the public schools. We're in schools that provide 300 million meals a year to kids. So when I think what you have to do, we have food deserts in this country where people can't find healthy food to buy in their neighborhoods. And that's got to be addressed. But even more than that, we have hunger in this country. And, you know, I have talked to young people who have told me that they and their friends are routinely hungry, that they don't have enough to eat, and it puts them in a terrible position in terms of trying to get access to food. So when we think about the absolute basic job of a government, it's to make sure that we provide for the basic needs of citizens, and food has got to be one of them. And the fact that we're having this conversation in 2019 in the richest country in the history of the world shows how far off we've gone from what's right. Look, I'm running because I believe these corporations have bought the government, and I believe that they've trashed, that they've stomped on the absolute rights of Americans. And that includes the right to affordable health care for every American, the right to quality public education from pre-K through college, the right to a living wage. One job should be enough. The way the money's being distributed is shameful. And the right to clean air and clean water. But good grief, food, the right to food and a roof over your head, that's part of America. So when you ask me, what am I willing to do? Amy was asking me, what am I willing to do to let people live without being poisoned? We've got to change the United States. Something has gone terribly wrong, and we like to make it seem too complicated. It's not complicated. What they're doing is cutting taxes on rich people and big corporations, and then they're taking away education funds, healthcare funds, attacking unions and working people's right to earn, and allowing pollution. That's their whole economic program. And the reason we have to take away their right to write the laws, take away their stranglehold of our government, is we need to undo every single one of those things. We need to give back to the American people our share of this country. And it can no longer be run for these corporations. The idea that young people in America, that we would question whether it's a good investment that young people be fed, makes no sense. Of course, the way we're going to succeed is by investing in Americans. That's how we're going to prosper, by Americans succeeding. And so if we invest, Brandon, in young people, including education and food, and a roof over their head, that's the best investment we'll ever make. That's the investment that will make us succeed. That's the investment that will make us proud. And that's the investment we will definitely make, but first we're gonna have to break these corporations. And that's why I'm running for president, because I never wanna hear that question. What are we gonna do to provide food for young people? We should already have done that.
So, I'd like to ask you, Tom Steyer, about foreign policy. As president, of course, a critical area. We're speaking to you just hours after a court in Brazil has released the former president of Brazil, Lula. after he was imprisoned under this administration of the far-right president, Jair Bolsonaro, who basically says the Amazon is open for business, the lungs of the planet. We're speaking to you in the week that President Trump has said he's moving forward with pulling the United States out of the Paris Climate Accord. And we're speaking to you just after Davos in the desert, what many call the disaster in the desert, where President Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, his Treasury Secretary, Steve Mnuchin, and other corporate executives went to Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, essentially shoring up the regime there, as Human Rights Watch has come out with a report talking about the catastrophe that Mohammed bin Salman represents when it comes to, for example, human rights activists, particularly the abuse of women in prison. What would you do about these relationships with the fossil fuel giant that is Saudi Arabia, with the close relationship Trump has with Bolsonaro?
So let me say this. Every single thing that Mr. Trump believes about foreign policy, I disagree with. It's a simple rule. He doesn't believe that we have real allies. He believes we can only confront people and compete with them and try and bully them. He doesn't believe that we can cooperate with people and create coalitions the way President Obama did. And in particular, he doesn't believe that we can lead the world on values. His friends are all dictators. Everything he stands for, I disagree with. And let me say this, the number one thing I would do in foreign policy is lead the world on climate and restore the United States as the moral leaders of the world. Look, I don't believe we can solve the climate crisis without putting environmental justice at the heart. But I also don't believe we can solve the climate crisis inside the borders of the United States. I think we have to lead the rest of the world. In fact, we all know we have to lead the rest of the world. And there's no second choice. So if we're going to rebuild the United States, if we're going to undo the inherent racism in the way we've polluted, if we're going to create millions of jobs and rebuild our spiritual center here, we're also going to have to do it around the world. And that is actually going to be the rebirth of us as the moral leaders of the world and the technological leaders of the world and the financial and commercial leaders. This is what we're going to have to do. We can do it. We can definitely do it. It's going to make us better employed, more jobs, better paying jobs, healthier, and it's going to restore the moral center to the United States of America to where it should be, where we stand up for our values here, justice at home, values abroad. That's what we're going to do.
You mentioned climate change. So what is the boldest move you would do to impact climate change?
Well, I do think declaring a state of emergency on day one counts as bold. I do think that making it environmental justice focused and have the planning process go from community up is bold. And I think that making it the heart of my international policy is bold. But I think the biggest thing, Mustafa, that I see is we don't have a choice here, and we don't have a choice in succeeding unless we put morality at the center, which means justice at the center. This isn't gonna work unless we do it in a way that we understand what's been unjust, where there's been racism, where there has been cruelty. We acknowledge it and we undo it. That is actually how we're going to succeed in dealing with climate.
Tom Steyer, you've been leading a movement to impeach President Trump. When it comes to the issue of environmental justice and environmental racism, what would be the articles of impeachment you would write against him?
For Mr. Trump? Oh my goodness gracious. Whew. Well, let me say that One of the people, I started the Need to Impeach movement that more than 8 million people signed on to over 2 years ago. But I want to be clear that I wasn't the first person, and there is a congressman from Houston, Texas, named Al Green, who beat me to it, who I have a lot of respect for. And I've talked to Congressman Green multiple times, and he always says to me, Tom, I know that this guy's a criminal and you're holding him up to the world as a criminal, but I'm pushing for him to be impeached and removed because he's a racist. And that's my reason. So everything else to me is secondary. So when I look at what he's done from withdrawing the people he's appointed to all of the environmental posts who are apologists for fossil fuels, withdrawing from Paris to show the world he has disdain for even attempting it, trying to increase the subsidies to fossil fuels, cutting the heart out of the EPA. You know, he's never missed an opportunity to do the right thing, to do the wrong thing. He's never been right. It's kind of like if you imagine the worst thing he could do, he immediately does it. So but look, you can't impeach a president on policy. This president is a criminal. You can impeach a president who's a criminal for criminal acts. And the fact that his policy is also dead wrong is not a coincidence, but you have to get him on the criminal acts, Amy, and he's done a lot of them.
Well, Tom Steyer, we want to say thank you very much for spending this half hour with us.
Can I just say one thing, just so you guys know? This is where my heart is. Seriously. This is not, I started by saying this is not a side issue for me. This is the issue. This is how we rebuild a great country together, and we have to acknowledge where we are. Thank you.
You are watching the first ever presidential forum on environmental justice.